Today, we are going to talk about externalities. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to do 6 things. First, you should be able to explain what production and consumption externalities are and provide examples of real-world markets in which there are externalities. You should be able to modify market models to capture the effects of externalities and analyze the effects of the externality on the market outcome. Lastly, you should be able to predict the effects of policies to address externalities on the market outcome and consider the pros and cons of alternative policy instruments to address externalities. To begin, let's start by defining exactly what an externality is. An externality occurs when one individual's market activity affects the profits or utility of one or more other individuals. Note that these other individuals may be either firms or consumers, and they may be participants in the same market in which the externality is generated or in a different market. To further clarify this definition, let's consider some examples. One type of externality is a consumption externality. Consumption externalities occur when the activities of some participants in the market affect the utility of others. Consumption externalities can be either firm to consumer or consumer to consumer. The key part of the definition is that in either case, one or more consumers are affected by the market activity. Let's consider some examples of consumption externalities. Suppose that I live on a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. Then a new airport is built, and the flight path of the planes is right over my house. Now I must deal with airplane noise night and day. The noise from the market activities occurring at the airport diminishes my utility from living in a quiet neighborhood. This is an example of a firm-to-consumer consumption externality. We could use a similar example to illustrate a consumer-to-consumer consumption externality. Suppose that I keep my house and yard well-maintained and tidy, but my neighbors like to keep old cars in their front yard. This diminishes the look of the neighborhood and other neighbors' property values. Thus, one neighbor's consumption imposes costs on other neighbors. This is why, in many neighborhoods, there are homeowners associations who regulate the appearance of homes in the neighborhood. As we will see later in this lesson, regulation is one way to deal with externalities. With a production externality, the situation is reversed. Instead of consumers being affected by the economic activity of others, firms are. As an example, consider 2 firms, a factory and a fishing guide. Suppose that the factory is located upstream of where the fishing guide takes his clients and releases pollution into the waterway. As a result, the fishing guide has to travel longer distances to take his clients to fishable waters, and his costs are increased. Thus, his profits are reduced. This example is a classic example of a producer-to-producer production externality. We could modify this example to represent a consumer-to-producer production externality. All we need to do is replace the factory with a toilet, or more realistically, a lot of toilets. If the water pollution is caused by consumption activity rather than production activity, then we have a consumer-to-producer production externality. The key is that in either case, a producer's costs and hence his profits are affected. So far, all of the examples have involved negative externalities. With a negative externality, the economic activities of some reduce the profits or utility of others. However, some economic activities generate positive externalities. With a positive externality, the economic activity of some increases the profits or utility of others. One classic example of an economic activity that generates positive externalities is beekeeping. Bees are pollinators. Many farmers pay to have bees brought to their farms in large trucks to pollinate their crops. However, if you are lucky enough to have a farm or orchard that is located next to a beekeeper, you will avoid the cost of bringing in bees. Thus, the beekeeper's activities result in a positive externality for you. In general, competitive market outcomes are not Pareto efficient in the presence of externalities. The reason for this is that when externalities are present, not all of the costs or benefits associated with the production or consumption of a good are captured in the market transaction. Because market participants are making decisions without incorporating all the costs or benefits of the decision, the outcome is inefficient. Let's consider some examples. First, we'll consider the case of a negative externality. Before we consider the case of the externality, we'll start with the baseline case. Recall that the supply curve captures all the costs to producers, including opportunity costs, of producing a good. Thus, we can say that the supply curve reflects the marginal private costs of producing the good, or MPC for short. If all of the costs associated with the good are paid by the producers, then all the costs to the market, and hence to society, of producing the good are also captured in the supply curve. We call these costs the marginal social costs. Similarly, the demand curve represents the marginal private benefits to consumers of consuming the good. If all of the benefits of consumption are enjoyed by the consumers of the good, then these benefits reflect all the benefits to society from the good as well, or the marginal social benefits. In equilibrium, the marginal social costs and benefits from the good are equalized, and it is not possible to make anyone in the market better off without making someone else worse off, which is the definition of a Pareto efficient outcome. There are two ways to consider the effects of a negative externality on a market. First, we could consider it from the benefits perspective. We know that with a consumption externality, some consumers are damaged by the good. If the damage is caused by consumers, the social benefits of consumption are less than the private benefits of consumption, so that the social benefit curve is below the demand curve. Thus, the socially optimal quantity of the good will be less than the amount produced in the private market. We can also consider a negative externality from the perspective of costs. If either firms or consumers are damaged by the production of a good, then we can say that the marginal social costs of production are higher than the marginal private costs of production, and the socially optimal quantity of the good is less than what will be produced by the private market. Regardless of the perspective that we take, when there is a negative externality in a market, the socially optimal quantity of the good is less than the privately optimal quantity. You should keep this idea in mind when considering policies to remedy negative externalities, as the appropriate policies are going to be ones that incentivize the market participants to produce and consume a lower quantity of a good. You should already have an idea of what some of those policies are. The situation is exactly reversed when a market is affected by positive externalities. If there are positive consumption externalities, then the marginal private benefits of consuming the good are less than the marginal social benefits, so that the social benefit curve is above the private benefit curve. In this case, the socially optimal quantity of the good is greater than the privately optimal quantity. If the positive externality affects producers, as in the beekeeping example, then the social costs of production are less than the private costs of production, and the marginal social cost curve is below the supply curve. In this case as well, the socially optimal quantity of the good is greater than the privately optimal quantity. Here again, regardless of the perspective that we take, when there is a positive externality in a market, the socially optimal quantity of the good is greater than the privately optimal quantity. When considering policies to remedy positive externalities, think about ones that will incentivize the market participants to produce and consume more of a good. Now that we've got an idea of what externalities are and what their effects are on a market, let's consider some possible remedies. If we implement a remedy to an externality, our goal is to generate an outcome that is better in terms of efficiency than the outcome that will result if the market is left to function without interference. For activities that generate negative externalities, we want to create incentives for sellers and buyers to produce and consume less of the externality generating good than they would otherwise. For activities that generate positive externalities, we want to create incentives for sellers and buyers to produce and consume more of the externality generating good than they would otherwise. Our first option for remedying externalities is to assign property rights to the good that is affected by the externality. Let's consider the example of the factory and the fishing guide. Fundamentally, the problem is that no one has property rights to the clean water in the river. So we can address the externality by assigning property rights to the river. We can do this in two ways. One option is to assign the rights to the clean water to the fishing guide. If the factory wants to release pollution, it will have to pay the guide for the use of his clean river. The factory has two options. It can either choose to produce its product in a way that does not pollute the river, or it can pay to dump the byproducts of its production process into the river. As a good profit maximizer, and hence cost minimizer, the factory will choose whichever option is cheaper. The guide can charge enough for the use of the river water that he is compensated for his costs if he has to move downstream. Now that polluting has a cost, the quantity of pollution is less, which was the goal of the policy. A second option is to assign the property right to the river to the factory. In this case, if the fishing guide wants to use the clean river for his business, he can pay the factory not to pollute. As long as the amount he has to pay the factory is less than his cost of moving downstream, he will be willing to pay for the right to use the river. In addition, now that the clean river is a source of revenue for the factory has an incentive to keep it clean so that the sale of its use adds to its bottom line. Note that both of these approaches can result in a Pareto-efficient outcome. However, they have very different outcomes from an equity perspective. One might argue from an ethical perspective against giving the factory the right to charge for not polluting the river. Despite these ethical objections, this assignment of property rights can result in a Pareto-efficient outcome. The idea that externalities can be remedied by assigning property rights to the good affected by the externality, and that the outcome of the externality does not depend on who has the property right, was first proposed by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase in his 1960 Journal of Law and Economics paper, The Problem of Social Cost. This idea has come to become known as the Coase theorem, and it is a fundamental part of environmental and natural resource economics, as well as other branches of economics today. Note that a key aspect of this theorem is the idea that resolving the externality does not depend on who gets the property right. In our example, in the previous slide, we could have also assigned the property right to the river to a third party, who then could have charged both the factory and the fishing guide for the use of the river. Although using property rights to resolve externalities does not depend on who gets the property right, it will only work if transactions costs are low. The second way to remedy externalities is through regulation. If we know the socially optimal quantity of the externality generating good, we can simply tell sellers how much they must produce. In practice, this is what homeowners associations do. In the U.S., homeowners associations can regulate what property owners are and are not allowed to store on their property, the allowable exterior colors of the home, and even how often a homeowner should mow the grass. By regulating these things, the Homeowners Association is essentially specifying the socially optimal quantity of home repair and maintenance that homeowners must provide. When a homeowner purchases a house in a neighborhood with a homeowners association, they agree to abide by the rules of the association as a part of the purchase. If they do not like the rules, they can simply choose not to buy in that neighborhood. Regulation can be used to generate socially optimal quantities of goods that generate either positive or negative externalities. The problem with regulation is that we have to know the socially optimal quantity of the good in order to arrive at an efficient solution, and often we don't know what that socially optimal quantity is. This is one of the criticisms of homeowners associations, which some believe are overly zealous in their regulation of homeowner behavior. The third way that we can remedy externalities is through taxes or subsidies. When there is a negative externality in a market, we know that the socially optimal quantity of a good will be less than the privately optimal quantity. To arrive at the socially optimal quantity of the good, we can tax the externality generating behavior. If the externality is generated by consumers, we can tax the consumption of that good, which will result in a downward shift of the demand curve. If the amount of the tax equals the amount by which the marginal social benefits of the externality are less than the marginal private benefits, then the tax will be successful at generating a Pareto efficient outcome. If the negative externality is generated by production activity, then we can tax the producers. This will shift the supply curve up by the amount of the marginal cost of the externality on society and result in a socially efficient quantity of the good being produced. One example of this kind of tax that has been much talked about in recent years is a carbon tax. The point of a carbon tax is to disincentivize activities which generate carbon dioxide emissions that contribute to global warming. The problem with using taxes such as this to address externalities is that in order to generate an efficient outcome, we need to know what the appropriate level of the tax is. The optimal tax will be the difference between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost of carbon-generating activities. We could call this amount the marginal social cost of carbon. Economists have worked to estimate an appropriate dollar amount for this tax, and this is still a topic of much debate. If an activity generates a positive externality, instead of taxing it, we can subsidize it. If the externality is generated by consumer activity, we can subsidize them so that they increase their demand for the activity. Or, if the activity is created by producers, we can subsidize them so that their costs of production fall, thus encouraging them to produce more. As with a tax, using subsidies to generate efficient outcomes depends on getting the amount of the subsidy correct. The final way to remedy externalities is to create a market for the externality itself. Let's reconsider the example of the factory and the fishing guide. In order to address water pollution, we could create a market for permits for water pollution. Suppose that for every gallon of pollution the firm emits, it has to buy a permit. Now, instead of treating the clean water as a free resource, the firm has to pay for it. If the firm finds a way to produce its product without emitting as much pollution, it can sell its excess permits and make money. If the fishing guide wants cleaner water, he can buy permits and pull them off the market, thus driving up the price and making it more expensive for the firm to pollute. In fact, in principle, anyone can buy a permit. Whether they use it to emit pollution or pull it off the market to get a cleaner river is up to them. We would expect to see the market for permits adjust until the marginal benefit of the last unit of pollution emitted just equals the marginal cost to society of the pollution. At this point, the market price will reflect the marginal social cost of the pollution. Thus, the pollution permit market will help us to figure out the cost of pollution, which we could have only guessed at if we had taken a taxation approach instead. When we arrive at a price of an externality that just equals the marginal social cost of the externality, either through a permit trading program or through a taxation scheme, the price is called a Pigouvian tax, named after the economist Arthur Pigou, who first proposed these types of taxes as a remedy for externalities in his book, The Economics of Welfare, published in 1920. Lest you think that these ideas only exist in theory, there are several examples of real-world pollution trading markets. One of the most successful markets was the market for sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide pollution permits in the U.S. This market began in the mid-1990s and was designed to limit emissions of the two pollutants that are major contributors to acid rain. While the market was in existence, it resulted in a significant reduction in acid rain emissions at a lower cost than the standard technology-based command and control regulations. Unfortunately, this market collapsed in the early 2000s after a court ruling outlawed the use of the market to reduce mercury emissions as well. You can see the collapse of the market in this graph. In 2007, the price of a ton of nitrogen oxide emissions was almost $800 per ton, while it was only $15 per ton in 2011. Another indication of the collapse, not shown here, is the sharp decline in the number of permits traded after the court ruling. This concludes this lesson on externalities.